There we go.
There we go. Yo.
Wine school number 9.
I feel like whenever this happens, it's like at a rodeo, like the bowl is like
it just come raging out of the gate. The wine bowls. Cool. Welcome everyone again. Hopefully you're all joining us for a second or third or 9th time for wine school. As always, we'll get started in a second. We're just going to let people flow in, and we'll drop all of the necessary things you need in the chat, which is, I guess, just our worksheet for today's class, which is Nebbiolo. So I think, what's up, Washington C? Yeah, we'll drop it in the chat, and we'll also make sure it gets in the Q&A there, so everybody has the worksheet. So yeah, welcome back. Hope everybody's having a good Tuesday. Grant, your flower crown looks amazing as always.
Yeah, we're good. I don't know what. Hey, is this the weekend of? Would this have been EatsCon?
EatsCon would have been just past Saturday that just passed.
Oh shit!
Weird, man.
I would have felt very LA wearing a flower crown at EatsCon.
Could have just still had it on from EatsCon. A few days later.
Exactly. I'm just like a wristband. I should have never taken off that EatsCon New York wristband.
Yeah. Joey, you got the book. That's awesome. Thank you, man. Really appreciate it. Thank you for buying it. Glad you enjoyed it. It's been cool. It's been fun to see it land in people get it in their hands. It's kind of when you work on something for, I guess, a full year, it's cool to see it exist. So thank you guys for that. More people are flowing in, so we'll give it a minute or two before we get started. Somebody hopefully from our team can drop the worksheet in the chat. Make sure you got it. There it is. Thank you. So if this is your first time, we have a worksheet that goes along with wine class just to keep it organized and keep it structured, because the first one of these things we did, Grant and I just got buzzed and talked for an hour, and I'm not sure how useful that was, but the worksheets have been good. And if you hit us up and you don't have one from the last class or 2 or 3 that you couldn't join us for, we can hook you up with that. And I think actually we're also recording all of these. So reach out if you haven't. The best way to interact with us, outside of this Zoom session, is you can email us at wineattheinfatuation.com. Grant's on there too. We'll all see it, and we can answer questions and get you stuff that you might have missed from wine schools past. And if you're new, also, just to make sure everybody knows, basically the way this works is we have a 6-pack, a wine school 6-pack that will prepare you for all of these classes. So you can buy it through Parcel at parcel.com. And then, you can have the wines that we're, talking about now, talking about the coming weeks. And then a few of them have already passed. So if you want to get, if you buy the 6-pack and you want the videos or the worksheets from us, let us know and we'll hook you up. So give it a couple more minutes here.
What are we going to talk about next week?
What are we talking about next week? I don't even know if I know.
We're going to do natural wine.
Oh shit, that's next week?
I don't know how to respond to that.
Sorry, hold on. My Siri is popping off for me. I don't know why. Natural wine is next
Siri,
week.
what are we doing next week?
Yeah, I'll ask Siri. That's a big one. All right. Prepared for the controversial takes that Grant has on natural wine, and I do too, probably. Cool. So we'll give another 1 minute, and then we'll get started. Again, if you are just joining us, worksheet is in the chat box. You can download it there and follow along. Please ask questions in the Q&A section. Our good friend and world-class sommelier Cedric is on as well. Again, thanks, Cedric. He will be manning the Q&A chat and answering your questions. So certainly if we can't, drop a question in there and he'll hit it, and we'll try and pick some of the, as many of them off as we can as well. But hopefully that way nothing gets missed as we go along. Cool. I think we can get started. You ready, Grant?
I'm ready. Yeah, do I have it? Yeah, I got the bottle in the background now. I'm ready. All right.
All right. So today, like we said, we're talking about Nebbiolo, which there's a lot to talk about. Hopefully you all have the bottle from our 6-pack, which is the Vietti Nebbiolo Perbacco. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Vietti. We'll talk about as a whole. But let's start off and just talk about Nebbiolo. What are the key things to know, Grant?
Nebbiolo. All right. So Nebbiolo, which you can see down low there. So Nebbiolo is a grape, right? So we talk about regions and grapes. And in this instance, we're going to talk about both in terms of what you see on a wine. So Nebbiolo is a grape. It's a grape that I think is really kind of hard to pin down, whether it's like a light wine or a big wine, because it's one of the few grapes that you see made in a lot of different kind of ranges in the spectrum of the wine either being really refreshing or something that is really dense and powerful and needs time to age. So the one that we threw in the How to Drink Wine 6-pack round 2 is from a producer named Vietti, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is definitely the wine, and we'll talk about this too with them, but they make a range of wines that start at like light and kind of definitely go to more powerful. And this is on the light end of the spectrum. And so I think it's a really good example of exactly what the grape tastes like before you introduce aging into it. So for me, Nebbiolo is a grape that it looks like Pinot Noir when you pour it in the glass, right? It's really light and doesn't have a ton of like kind of blue purple color to it that you get with some other grapes. It's a grape that in this style, as far as the Perbacco goes, I think is really like fruity and really floral and just really fresh, instead of being the kind of flavor of more like cigar or kind of smoky flavors, dried sort of flavors, which you would get in some of the other wines. It's a grape that is only planted in this one part of the world, which is northwestern Italy. So if you can imagine like Milan on the map, it's the Mediterranean coast and up to Switzerland, France border there. It's a whole section, mostly called Piemonte or Piedmont. And then a little bit, you see it right up on the front. There's Turin. They had the Olympics there. Shout out Winter Olympics. And scan out so people can kind of see
Where it is, yeah.
where it is. All right.
It backs up to the Alps.
There you go. Yeah, you see Turin. It's all mapped out right there. It's not necessarily like the sexiest part of Italy. It's the Alps are up on the border. That's all the green, and then down in the white. It's kind of cool. You can where this wine is grown, you can look over one shoulder and see the mountains, and then on a clear day, you can look over the other shoulder and see the Mediterranean coast. It's not that far from it, but I would say from like Milan, it's about an hour and a half drive.
Super. I mean, it's actually a pretty easy place to visit. Once we can all travel again, if you're interested in visiting a place for the purpose of drinking wine, especially for those of you from New York, it's a pretty quick flight to Milan and then a drive, which is cool.
Definitely. So it grows in this area and it kind of like bounces around a little bit, but it's really not a grape that you see in many other parts of the world. There's one winemaker in Santa Barbara that makes a Nebbiolo. There's actually some grown in Mexico, which is just totally bizarre. And who knows, but it's not like Pinot or Cabernet, which you see all over the world. And the reason for that is that it's really hard grape to grow. It needs a really specific climate. And you just don't get, it's like a lot of risk for that, not that much reward as far as the grape goes. And because it's so light in color and has kind of a what can be a little bit of a particular taste because of the tannins, which is really the dryness of the wine. It was a wine that people weren't always able to enjoy it like on a daily basis, right? And so there's this thing when Nebbiolo is made into Barolo, which is where Chris is hanging out right now. which is where this producer is. Barolo is a region that when you see it on the label, it means it's 100% Nebbiolo. But when it's made into Barolo, and then some other regions we'll chat about, the wine is aged for a long period of time. But the reason why this wine is so light and I think easy drinking is because it's intentionally made in a style so that it's meant to be consumed just earlier and easier to drink. Just get that when you taste this, it's like should be like kind of a little tart and just refreshing and
yeah, it's much different than drinking a Barolo from the same producer.
Definitely.
And by the way, so this photo behind me is actually a photo I took from Vietti, and that's one of their bar vineyards behind me. But really producer. I think this wine is cool because it's sort of a good introduction to Nebbiolo. If you don't know much about the grape or you haven't had a bunch of Barolo before, it's kind of a good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. It's good. So I think that's why we wanted to throw this out there. So I think Nebbiolo can really be misunderstood because of the idea that Barolo is always this like big wine. But ultimately I think, when you see just Nebbiolo on the label, don't be afraid of the vintage, and it should be a really like light, easy drinking wine, which I think this Perbacco definitely is. And it's designed to be able to do that. So the thing that we were talking about in terms of regions, right, is, when we did like a wine school on Burgundy, right, white Burgundy, and we'll do red Burgundy down the road, is the region is Burgundy and the grape is Pinot Noir, right? And so here you can see, just like you can in Burgundy, you can see Pinot listed on the label. But if you see Nebbiolo just listed on the label, that means that the wine is going to be this lighter, kind of fruitier, fresher style. Then if you see a region specific, and this is where it gets hard to like memorize all these regions, but chances are you can find a list of them, but chances are that you'll definitely see Barolo before some of the other areas surrounding it. If you see Barolo, which I'll throw up on my screen now. Whoop.
Oh, can we double share screen? Does that work?
Barolo.
You just crash Zoom? Is that what happened?
I did. You got a share screen?
Can you? I don't even know what people can see right now. Can you see my screen? Can you see the Barolo, the Vietti Perbacco label?
You crash this shit. Yeah, that's a share screen.
Okay. Are you gonna share something?
No, it's just my virtual background.
Oh shit! Sorry, I got confused.
Keeping it easy. So so Barolo is it's an area within Piedmont, right? Barolo is actually a small little town, and then there's a whole cluster of hills where Chris is sitting right in the middle of it that are really special. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's really beautiful. There's all these winding hills, castles that are all cluttered with vineyards with amazing food. It's a perfect place to visit once you're out and about. This is I think the best wine region to go to if you want like bang for your buck, food, wine, and good people and good access. But Barolo, if you see Barolo on the label, that means that the wines need to age in oak barrels as well as in the bottle for at least 3 years before you can throw it on the label, right? And so what happens is through that aging process, and also through some decisions that winemakers kind of make collectively, is that they make a wine that it might still be light in color, but some of that like really kind of raspberry, almost like rose floral taste that you get in this wine, it starts to turn into smokier and kind of earthier flavors. And the wine also can be bigger and more tannic, which is that like when you drink this, if you want to like swish it around in your mouth, the tannin is what you feel like on the top of your lips. And this wine is definitely like the highest. It's the dryness and like bitterness of that.
Make your cheeks stick to your gums.
Yeah, exactly. Makes you need a glass of water.
Or more wine.
Or more wine. But it also is what it makes you need food. and it's what allows the wine to age for a long time. It's a preservative, just like acid is in it too. So Barolo on the other end of the spectrum, the wines are best when they kind of hit this like 5+ year mark. For a long time, people were saying Barolo needed to be like 20 years old before you could enjoy it, which is kind of obnoxious because it definitely alienates like a certain experience for people. And also people for a long time they had trouble selling the wine because people are like, well, I don't want to buy this if I gotta wait 10-15 years before I can enjoy it. And that's why a producer like Vietti made this Nebbiolo per Bacco. And they made it so that everybody had a wine by them made from Nebbiolo that you could just drink every day upon release. So Barolo is a region on the other kind of end of the valley there. Within Piedmont is another area called Barbaresco, which we put there. And those two areas together form, it's called the Langhe, which sometimes you see on a label, say Langhe Nebbiolo. The Langhe is like, think of it as like a county. These are towns within the county, and then the state is Piedmont. The Langhe is, I would say, Italy's like, but definitely the northern part of Italy's most important wine region. So they make a whole range of wines, mostly red wines, from the area.
And you'll see it on the label a lot, so it's kind of not. It's good to know what you're getting when you see that on a label, because you will see it pretty frequently.
And yeah, so Barolo and Barbaresco, just to clarify, is made from 100% Nebbiolo. But once you throw that name up on the label, the winemaker is forced to age the wine in a certain way. And the grapes have to come from a very specific place so that the wine then tastes different and the wines become richer in flavor and just kind of stronger across the board. But they're amazing wines, and definitely still from Nebbiolo. So we threw some producers in that too.
You want to hit a little bit about just like the difference, because I think people will see like Barolo and Barbaresco, and obviously very similar in a lot of ways. But you want to talk a little bit about the difference so that people know?
Yeah, so Barbaresco is it's a smaller area than Barolo. The difference is that people normally used to say that like Barbaresco was lighter and more elegant, and Barolo was bigger and more kind of earthy and rustic in taste. So the difference is if you see Barbaresco, chances are it, with the exception of really like one producer over there, Gaia, which you see a lot, that is, how do I throw that up in the chat? Q&A. Gaia, it's Gaja. That's really the only like expensive Barbaresco. I would say Barbaresco doesn't still today have like the cachet of Barolo. So the wines taste more similar to Barolo than they would to the Nebbiolo that we're drinking, but they often offer more value. They don't have to age quite as long, so they are sort of like a middle ground where they are kind of fruitier and floral and sort of lighter. To get really nuanced, the like soil is different over there. It's also a little bit higher in altitude than Barolo, just the hills there. So the wines have a really, really subtle difference between them. A producer like Vietti, though, makes both. They have some vineyards in Barbaresco and they have some vineyards in Barolo. And most people don't do that. They're like, cool, here's our house, here's our winery, here's our vineyards. But there's a handful of producers that kind of go between whatever, San Francisco and LA.
He makes a Barbera as well, and they make don't they make one other? Don't they make a white? Don't they make like an Arnaise or something like that?
Yeah, they make a whole bunch. They now make a couple different whites, but they make Arnaise, which is the kind of a grape like Sauvignon Blanc that's from this area too.
Cool.
But yeah, that's Barolo and Barbaresco. I tend to like kind of group them together. If you're there, they're definitely two different places. But the wines, if if you're having one from like the same producer, the Barbaresco is probably just a little bit lighter than the Barolo, depending on where it's from.
Cool. So let's do a little bit more of the kind of lesser known regions that grow this stuff.
Yeah,
that I'm passionate about. That we visited.
So this is cool. So I think right now, so here's what happened. Right, so after World War I, up until like World War II, there was because there was a big industrial revolution that existed in Italy. And what happened was that for a long time, Italy was just, they didn't manufacture stuff, right? And then all of a sudden they started making cars, and they made cars in Torino. It's where like Fiat is. It's where, a lot of just like big factories are. And that's only like an hour away from this area. And so what happened is that unless it was like Barolo and Barbaresco, kind of like the, mass movement that we experience here in America between like suburbs and the cities, is that everybody went to go work in the factory during this period because that's where they could make the most amount of money. But before that, everybody was farmers. And there was all these areas, right, that I think we listed in the sheet, but like Gattinara, Gamay, Brahmatera, that were all really important wine regions back then, pre-war. And all of the land was planted, like you'll see where Chris is in Barolo, it was all planted to vineyards. But then people weren't selling enough wine, or they didn't have people to work these vineyards. So the vineyards went abandoned for a really long time. Perfect. Nice segue there.
Nice transition, right?
That was good.
These are some vineyards up in Alto Piemonte.
Exactly. So this is actually, it's perfect. So this vineyard, you can see it doesn't really look like there's that much going on other than like a bunch of stakes in the ground. So this is a vineyard that was just planted, but 100 years ago, this vineyard and where all those trees are was all vineyards. But everybody went to the factories. They're like, screw it. We're not making any money growing grapes or making wine. We're going to get a job in the factories. And everybody left all these areas. Now that wine has become a thing, and also they're not manufacturing, almost anything in Italy anymore. People have come back, and there's this whole new renaissance in these areas that were really historic. And this vineyard in particular was cool. When we were there, you saw like they had to do all this crazy work of removing all these trees that have grown in over the last like 50, 60 years since it was once a vineyard. But back in the day, it was a really, really important place that made really great wine and had a lot more value.
I remember driving up, like we were driving up through those trees you can kind of see behind me. And even in those areas, there's still, if you look through the really thick brush, you'll still see really old vines that are just kind of like tangled up with the rest of all the foliage and stuff that's grown over like 100 years. It's pretty crazy.
That's crazy. And so these areas nowadays, the grape is still Nebbiolo up there because Barolo is only like 45 minutes down. This is up north. It's called Alto Piemonte. And you won't see Alto Piemonte on a label, but in a restaurant, or if you like go to a geeky wine shop, you say, hey, I want to try a wine from Alto Piemonte. They'll guide you there. And the reason they call it Alto Piemonte instead of a specific town is because there's a whole bunch of these little towns that nowadays are becoming a little bit more recognizable as producers are starting to come back. And people are really realizing that there's great wine and it has great potential here. And so there's probably 7 towns that have nothing going on in the towns themselves, but people are starting to come back and really take wine seriously. And there's a handful of people who are sort of like the Renaissance people. We went to this one winery that was an old winery. It's like a 150-year-old winery that nobody messed with for a little while. This young kid who's a friend of mine, he bought it. And now he's like a superstar in the area, and he's kind of like rediscovered all these old vineyards. It's a really cool thing that's going on. But he said that the total amount of vineyards that are planted there today, 100 years ago, it was actually 1,000 times more acreage than what they have today. So like 1 acre per 1,000. The whole area was all grapes back in the day, which is totally crazy. So there's really not that much wine being made there now. Every year they kind of like double it and more and more.
Feels like that's changing pretty quick.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely changing quick. So
I think I'm saying too, like most of this area right now, I think is cashmere production, or a lot of it is. So a lot of the stuff that gets made for Chanel and a lot of these big houses, the cashmere gets produced here, which is kind of interesting.
Definitely. That young producer, his name, it's called Garella and Colombera. Just got a good little write-up from Antonio Galoni, so his wine just blew up. His name's Cristiano Garella. You might have a photo of him from that day. But he makes wine for about like 6 or 7 different wineries up in that area. But Cristiano Garella, like Cristiano.
And one thing just for what Graham was talking about in terms of seeing these wines on like, you know, restaurant lists and things like that. I feel like Gattinara is probably one of the most common regions that you'll see listed on a menu. And that's, you know, sometimes if I don't know some of the producers, I'll look for that and you'll see a decent amount of those wines, I feel like, at least in some of the New York City restaurants on the list.
Yeah. And so real quick, the difference between say like Barolo and then these areas, it has to do with two different things. So first is the altitude, right? So like where Chris is standing, if you go like straight behind him, that's dead south and you'll hit the Mediterranean and you can't see it because it was kind of a cloudy day, but the hills of Barolo and Barbaresco pop up there. But like what Chris would be looking at are these giant dramatic Italian Alps. And the glaciers, there's still glaciers up there. The glaciers formed all these really unique pockets of hills that have different soil types within them. And in particular, in Alto Piemonte, you have a lot of like really sandy soils versus in Barolo, you have a really like denser soil from clay. And the difference between like really wet, like clay-like soils, somebody asked about like terroir here, and sandy soils it's the same analogy of like clay weighs a lot more than sand. If you fill your hand up with clay and fill your hand up with sand, right? And so the wines from Alto Piemonte, there's like volcanic soil. It's just, you can really nerd out on like each hill having a different kind of flavor to it. But the soils in Barolo are predominantly clay. It's this really dense soil that makes the wines bigger and richer. Whereas up in Alto Piemonte, because of the way the glaciers just like drag shit around and there's volcanoes around in this area, it's this really diverse area that created different soil types. So although the grape is totally the same, the wines have a lot of different flavors. So it's kind of cool to try the same vintage. A lot of producers follow a similar recipe as far as winemaking goes. And you can really taste the differences between them. I would say Alto Piemonte leans to be lighter, more in the Barbaresco, even more so in the like Nebbiolo like camp. And the wines are definitely lower in alcohol too. So they're a little bit crisper rather than being kind of richer. That's a good question though. One thing that I did want to, we just kind of glazed over, we mentioned the white grape of the Langhe, the other red grape, which if we keep this thing going, we'll definitely, we wrote about it in our book, is Barbera. Barbera is darker in color, but sort of easier in flavor. It's like the lunch wine. You would never, you know, if you're drinking wine, like
one way or another.
Yeah, you're drinking wine twice a day, especially when you're visiting there. You know, you go crush a bottle of wine, take a nap, and then have another bottle of wine at dinner. That's sort of the Italian routine, and maybe our routine in quarantine. But is that Barbera it's really fruity and juicy and kind of lighter, but it's a totally different grape. You don't see any towns that if it's Barbera, it will always say Barbera on the label, right? So no matter what, if you're looking for Barbera, look for the word Barbera. It might be from a different town, but there's no towns to where if it like Barolo, the grape is 100% Nebbiolo. There's nothing confusing like that. So, and it always should be cheap and drunk.
Good and expensive wine. You see it like Barbera de Alba or Barbera de Asti, like some of those big towns in the area get tagged on the end of it. But yeah, Barbera is a good one if you just want to drink something while you eat some pizza and not spend a lot of money.
Definitely. Ali Love in the mix. She, the next thing I think we should talk about is this producer a little bit, too, Vietti, because I definitely think it'll probably
Yeah, we were just
question.
doing another one of these for a smaller group of Infatuation members, and we kind of wanted to just sort of like talk a little bit more about the producer in that one because we had a little more time and knew we were going to do this, but we were talking about Vietti specifically because I think especially now so much of what people love about drinking and discovering wine is the stories that sort of go along with the winemakers, and Vietti's a really just like storied and interesting and cool group of people that make the wine and have a lot put a lot of care into it. Grant has a relationship with them, and you want to sort of talk about who they are and why you think they're special.
Yeah. So Vietti is definitely like a historic winery in Barolo region, in the area. So they're making wines in the 1800s. Up until World War I, they made wine in just like how everybody was doing. They bottled a little bit of wine for themselves in like their own bottles with their own labels, but they made what's like jug wine, big, giant. They're called demi-johns. They're like, I don't know, sort of, not teenage, like pre-teen sized bottles of wine. Like 4 feet tall and like chubby preteens. So they are giant bottles of wine, and they would just like put them on the train that ran through the valley of the hills in Barolo and Barbaresco, and it would get sort of shipped around. And then the wars came, and like we were talking about, Barolo had a similar thing going on, to where a lot of people left the region. But Vietti in particular, they had to sell off all their vineyards, and then after World War I, they came back and they slowly started to acquire their vineyards again in the 40s and into the 50s. And then the father of the now winemaker, whose name is Luca, his dad was named Alfredo. He was really considered like an icon in the area, and he's still a total like legend, and his influence is really important because he was one of the first people at that point to say like, hey, we're going to take ourselves seriously, and the wine that we make, we're going to be like proud of the place where it's from. And what he did was he was like, cool, we're going to make the best wine possible rather than make wine just to sell it. So he really focused on the product rather than just like the bulk and the production of it. And then he also started to consider really simple things like early marketing, whether that was how to talk about the wine, label design, and things like that, that now are like, seem like you wouldn't, it's not really like, there's all sorts of wacky labels out there, but I'll throw it up here is, I don't know, simple things like he's had this artist who's still around actually. He's this old guy who's done all these like hand drawings of these labels.
Yeah,
nobody did that back in the day.
and they're different for every release, right?
Yeah, exactly. For every like specific wine that they make. But more than anything, it was just like, cool, we're going to take ourselves seriously. We're going to make really great wine, even if people aren't buying it. And nobody bought it for a long time. And Ali asked a question earlier about like these wines being polarizing, and the wines are polarizing because Barolo is a wine that can be kind of hard to drink. It's not always like really crowd pleasing, because I think crowd pleasing wines are these like fruitier, almost sweeter, kind of chuggable wines. And Barolo, and especially like what we'll talk a little bit about is like old school, like rustic Barolo, was made in a style to where the wines had this really like tannic taste to it, to where people still today, they drink it and they're like, oh, that's just like too bitter. It's too dry of a wine. And so I think Barolo can, some people like really love it and they love like that flavor. It's like, I don't know, it's like spicy food, right? It's like, not everybody loves spicy food. I love the stuff, but like this wine is definitely has like a taste to it that stands out versus just being like sweet and you know and easy to drink. So that being said, is like what they did as a winery back then is he started to come up with kind of interesting ways that I think now are really commonplace for people to try to understand the wines a little bit better. And one thing that he did, and this was in the 60s, and he was the first person in Italy to do this. So you see Barolo over my shoulder, and then just below it, I think it's backwards. I don't know, is it backwards?
No, it's only backwards for you.
It's like a mirror. You see Lazzarito. So Lazzarito is the name of a vineyard. Chris, can you bounce back to Barolo now that we're out of Alto Piemonte on the home screen? So Lazzarito is like a little plot of land. Think of it like your garden versus your neighbor's garden. What you grow in your garden is going to taste different than your neighbor.
There's your garden. There's your neighbor's garden.
Everything dies in my garden.
Yeah.
Even at home tending to my plant.
You and your neighbor are friends. You talk over the fence at each other. It's all good.
Yeah, exactly. But it's different. And you see like that line there. And so what he said, he's like, screw it. He's like, Barolo's a region. He's like, but I'm even going to say that every little bit of Barolo tastes a little bit different. And he took that idea from France. And with that, him and a couple of other winemakers really like actually like hit the road and kind of went out there, and they were like, we make great wine, and we're going to put our wine out there as being a great wine, not an everyday drinking wine. And we're going to tell you these things like it has to age for a really long time. It's from a really specific place, and this place is really, really special. And they weren't wrong. All of those things were right, but they really created what, you know, people now recognize as like a premier wine region in Italy. And this guy, Vietti, is the winery that I think, you know, there's only a couple of other people that really band together that really created this dialogue and created, you know, kind of the association that we have with as Barolo being like Italy's most premier and also most expensive wine region. And Vietti also, I think, you know, nowadays, even more so within that, they're a winery that makes like a whole range of wines. So the wine, like the label on my shoulder, that's probably like $150 to $200 bottle of wine. Whereas the Perbacco, you know, is like a $20 to $30 bottle of wine.
Yeah.
And
That's what's so special about it, is they have such a range. You can do the whole thing. I mean, you can start with entry-level wines, and then they have super collectible, obviously high-end stuff too.
Yeah, people just don't do that. They're like, or they don't do it well, right? And it's like, you think of, I don't know, you have like Prada, and Prada doesn't make cheap shit. They just make Prada, right? And if they made something cheap, they probably wouldn't call it Prada. They would, you know, do something else. And Vietti though is like, cool, we're gonna make like a less expensive wine, and it's gonna be good enough for us to throw our like very prestigious name on it. And we're also gonna continue to make, you know, our great like product too. And that doesn't always exist in wine. You kind of like camp people into like, oh cool, this is like the real deal, like prestigious stuff, or this is just like the value cheap stuff. But I think Vietti is a winery that is able to stretch those two things.
Well, and even this vineyard you see here is actually one of their Barbera vineyards, right? And so very unique. Basically Luca, and you should tell this story, but decided to plant Barbera in a place that actually is very, I think we just lost Grant. That this area would be a great place to grow Nebbiolo and make Barolo, and that's obviously more profitable. But Grant was basically, when we were on our last call, telling the story of essentially Luca, at his father's behest, he asked if he could plant Barbera in this space, and his dad said, absolutely not. You got to, you know, grow Nebbiolo there. And he planted the Barbera anyway, because it takes, you know, a good 3 or 4 years before those vines will produce fruit, and you know, before you can really tell the difference. So it does sort of end up demonstrating, I think, kind of the unique way that these guys think about making wine, and wanting to have, you know, different wines at different price points. And I think that's why we also just, you know, Grant's obviously been a big proponent of Vietti for a long time, and that's why we wanted to put it in the 6-pack, is that you can really, you know, you can try stuff and drink their wines without having to spend a bunch of money. And ultimately, it's a great way to kind of get introduced to Nebbiolo and to Barolo altogether. So we'll wait for Grant to jump back in. But one thing too that's great about Vietti, that once we get back into the world of visiting wineries again, and we mentioned in the earlier on that Piedmont's a great place to visit. It's easy to get to, but also you can schedule visits, which can be hard in parts of France, and certainly Burgundy and Bordeaux. And they're not exactly easy places to just make a phone call and bop in. Hey, Grant.
Back.
You got an echo going on there. You might be dialed into both.
I tried to hit on my phone. I fell over in my chair. We're doubling up here.
This is our second hour of wine school, so.
Exactly. Sorry, guys.
15 minutes left. We'll be all right. No, I was just talking about, I just sort of told the Barbera story about Luca planting grapes that he shouldn't have and ultimately getting grounded. But I was also just, while you were gone, I think this is a great place to visit. And I think, it's once we can all travel again, Piedmont is a place you should go. And, Vietti's a special spot because they're just super nice people and super passionate about what they do. And I think that's certainly for me, like anytime I drink this wine, I enjoy it because you think about good people that put a lot of work into it. And that's a big part of all this. So.
Definitely. I dialed in on my phone. So I heard I was listening.
Oh, so you were an attendee. That's so nice of you.
Attendee. Sorry about that. But yeah, totally. It's important. You want to support like good people, but also good people who make nice things, and you get both of that with these guys. But yeah, I think part of the reason we started this class off as the Nebbiolo class, and then in the book we wrote about Nebbiolo as an important wine to recognize, and we also wrote about Barolo. And the idea with that was that although it's the same grape, the wines are totally different, right? In that, like, for me, Nebbiolo, if you see a wine that just says Nebbiolo on it on the label, it always should be really light and almost like Pinot Noir, just super refreshing and easy to drink. Whereas Barolo is just a whole different experience, and it's a whole different wine, although it's from the same grape. And even in this instance, it's actually from the same area. And that comes down to how they make it. And we touched on that a little bit, but the difference is in terms of the way the wine tastes, starts with where it's grown, right? So like down in the valley where Chris is at there, those are like olive trees, but down in the lower part of the slope, the grapes will taste very differently than on the higher part of the slope, especially with Nebbiolo. And so what you'll see is that some grapes will age for a longer period of time versus other grapes, they might not age as long, which I know we touched on earlier, but will definitely change the overall flavor of that. So I think we covered Nebbiolo plus Barolo.
We have vintages on the worksheet that are probably worth just mentioning for people that pay attention.
Yeah, that's a thing. So vintage, I would say, is not as important for younger wines for Nebbiolo, but for Barolo, especially if you're gonna like pay up or you're going to get a wine that has like age on it that's older than 10 years old, the vintage is really important. And so we spoke about some vintages there. I think you can find these wines like even actually like good value, in the sense that you can find a 30-40-year-old bottle of Barolo from certain producers that costs $150, which is definitely not nothing. But considering that it's an older wine, Bordeaux at that age you're definitely up in the like $400 to $500 range. Is the vintage really changes how the wine tastes, but also its potential to be good after like 30-40 years. So vintages, it's interesting what happened because of climate change. We've spoken about this almost every section now, but it's definitely important, is that like what I think we listed from 1990 onward, but back in, so say like in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s, in those decades, you would only get like 2 or 3 really good vintages. So in the 60s, you have 61 and 64. In the 70s, you have 71, 74, 78. In the 80s, there's 4. In the 90s, there's 5. In the 2000s, there's 6. And then nowadays, pretty much since like 2012 on, every vintage is labeled as a really good vintage. And that's because back then, this area, because it's so close to the Alps, has really extreme weather. And so as climate change has benefited this area ultimately, is that back in like the 60s and 70s, the grapes couldn't get ripe enough to even really produce wine in certain vintages because it'd be too cold, it'd be too much rain, snow, whatever. Or if they produced wine, the wine would taste like really, really bitter and really, really tannic and just wouldn't be that good. So paying attention to the vintage is super important. And there's definitely like, more than I would say any other region in Italy, like the great vintages you'll see jump up a little bit in price, but are pretty noteworthy. So if you're looking to buy Barolo like young now and age it, I would say start with like 2010, 2012, 14, 15, 16, 2018, when those come around, people are really excited about. And if you're looking,
what's the youngest people should drink it?
the youngest, well, that's the thing is I think now like the wines are easier to, I'm drinking 2016 and it's pretty damn good. And that's because like it's definitely fruitier and riper. But I think, Vietti also makes like a style of wine that's easier to drink when it's young. But versus some other producers, and this is where it gets a little nuanced. It's harder their wines are made to age more than not. But I would say probably like the 5 to like 5, depending on the vintage, but 5 to like 10 years is definitely a good area right now. Like the 2010s to 2006s are really drinking really well.
Carolyn asked how you know if a vintage wine was stored properly prior to buying.
Yeah. You should look at the neck of it, which is like, no, you can't really see it. That part of it, like if it's really low and gets into like the wine bottles, like go like that, the neck's up top, and then those go around the sides. If it starts to get low, then you don't want that. But if it's an old bottle of wine and it looks like it's like the fill of the wine is perfect, then that's really important. And then if sometimes the cork can pop up, you don't want to mess with those. But it's kind of a crapshoot, unfortunately. Even we get burned. I want to answer Andrew's question because I think we might have mentioned that in the worksheet. But there's a little area just outside of Piedmont. It's kind of a cool area. It's called Valtellina, and they make some really, really cool. There's a couple of producers that are really like great value and make super wines. Our Pepe is one of them. Those wines are really like Pinot. They're really light and they really have this like crazy floral characteristic to them. So I would say they're a little bit lower in alcohol. They're not quite as tannic, quite as big as Barolo can be. And they drink, a little bit more refreshing, but they're still age worthy.
They're always affordable and fun to try.
Oh yeah, they're super good.
Cool.
So
some Lindsay, by the way, I think it's Lindsay's birthday. I saw. Happy birthday, Lindsay. She asked if Nebbiolo, like just talking through the because you touched on it a little bit, but Nebbiolo, Barolo, Barbaresco being aged in oak or stainless steel, and so you want to talk a little bit about oak, and because I know we touched on it, but just making sure we touch on it for all three. And
yeah, so Nebbiolo can be aged if you see Nebbiolo, it can be aged in stainless steel a little bit. Barolo and Barbaresco will always be aged in oak. Stainless steel produces like fruitier, really bright and kind of crisper wines. Once the wine starts aging in oak, it really changes the flavor of it. In Barolo, you see 2 different kind of camps. You see new oak, So where the wines will have more of an, like the actual flavor of the oak, where it'll be more vanilla, cinnamon, and kind of spicy. And then you see some producers like old oak barrels, these giant old oak barrels. And the idea with that is that the wines become earthier. There's oxygen that gets introduced to the wines in that way. And so the wines become a little bit more dried out. So the fruit, instead of tasting like, fresh berries, tastes more like fruit leather. And the flowers, instead of being really fresh, might smell more like cigar and kind of smoke in that way.
Cool.
Yeah. Someone asked about Pella Verga. It's an awesome grape that's grown in the Barolo area, kind of similar to Barbera, but it's lighter in color and can be really delicious, but hard to find. Definitely good stuff.
Joe is asking about Dolcetto and how it kind of fits in and compares, because some of these guys produce that too.
They do, yeah. Dolcetto is a weird grape. I don't totally understand it. So you don't see too much of it around, but Dolcetto's more similar to Barbera, and that it's like a lunch wine and an everyday drinking wine. It doesn't need to be aged. It should always be inexpensive. But Dolcetto, dolce means like sweet, but it's actually not sweet. It's super tart. It's like a tart cherry. It's really crisp. You should serve it chilled and not take it too serious. It's good, but not that much going on with Dolcetto.
A question from Michael. Can you age any Barolo? Like, is it sort of safe to say that Barolo broadly can be aged or should be aged?
Yeah, I think aging Barolo is, if people ask like, when should I drink this? And it's not just because, I'm in the business of you all drinking wine rather than storing wine. Like I want you to buy a bottle and drink it ASAP. But the thing with Barolo is that you can drink it young and it can also age for a really long time. But people often think that it like has to age in order for it to be ready to drink. But I would say just about any Barolo, unless it has like, it's really high in alcohol, if you see like 15.5, then the wines start to not be that interesting when they age. But nowadays, like these recent vintages, these wines will age, who knows, but based on like the consistent weather from years in the past, these wines will definitely age 20, 30 years. And as long as you're aging them in like a cool place and not moving them around, you're not aging them on your kitchen countertop throughout a New York summer. They'll be
on
good.
top of the refrigerator.
Yep.
Cool. So there's actually a good question here that is broad, but I think it's actually what we're talking about, which is Madison asks how you define cheap. And I think cheap is a word probably, if we said it, that's probably not the right word to use to describe any of these things. We try to sort of focus more on like value, I think, because it's so hard to define like what cheap means. But I think it's actually interesting as it relates to these wines, right? Because there's certainly just some realities of the process that mean these wines has to cost what they cost. But what would you consider an affordable young Barolo that isn't, hasn't been sitting in someone's cellar for a while?
Affordable young Barolo starts at like $50 for producers that you are worthy of spending, to where like you'll taste the difference of that jump up in price from like 20 to 30 or
Yeah.
20 to 50. So I would say like 50 on like, but really closer to like Barolo nowadays is probably like 70 to 150 for the younger wines. That's definitely the zone for it.
That's why I think, specifically with this Vietti wine, that can be cost prohibitive for a lot of people. So I think that's why we loved trying to turn people onto this, this Nebbiolo specifically, is it's a great way to try really good wine from a really great producer and not have to spend a bunch of money. But I think the reason I specifically thought that was a good question is it comes up a lot, which is this idea of like, what is cheap and what is affordable and what does that mean? And we'll get asked a lot about, what are some wines under $15 that are great that I can buy. And there's, I think, especially when you're talking about small producers that aren't making tons and tons of wine that get shipped to grocery stores, it can be hard to recommend stuff under like that $20 price point. But certainly these Barolos definitely have a high floor.
And if you can find them, you don't find them in like all the, stores everywhere, but you can definitely shop online and find them. But the wines from those regions that we were talking in Alto Piemonte, so like Gattinara and Gamay, Brahmatera, those wines can be $30-$40 and be like as serious as Barolo at the end of the day. They can be aged as long. They just don't have like the brand name and the cachet. So the producers don't get the same price.
So many times when I'm in a restaurant and I'm looking at a wine list and I can't or don't want to spend, serious money on Barolo, like some of those wines from Gattinara, like he was saying, are great and affordable, and at least more affordable and fun to drink.
Definitely. Yeah, that's definitely a good spot. But Nebbiolo is a grape that doesn't really have like much comparison. Pretty unique stuff.
Cool. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you guys for joining us for another one of these. For those of you that are here for the first time, thank you for jumping in with us. There's a few questions that before we wrap up, we'll answer. So if you email us wine@theinfatuation.com, we can hit you with recordings or worksheets or things like that you didn't get or don't have. Go to parcel.com, buy the wine 6-packs, follow along with us. Natural wine is next week. That's going to be a big one. We might need 2 full hours for that one. But otherwise, yeah, you can hit us up, theinfatuation.com. You can sign up for our wine newsletter there. And yeah, look, thank you so much. If you've bought How to Drink Wine, it was out as of last Tuesday. So there's a weird pixelated kind of vanishing version of it. That's a special edition. Thank you if you bought it. Really appreciate it. If you don't have it yet, you can get it at local bookstores, obviously Amazon. Parcel is selling it as well. So thanks for the support. Hope you like it. Please hit us with feedback. Review the book if you can on Amazon, even if you think it's terrible, we'll take it. But just really psyched that you guys have it, and thanks for joining us for these too. It's been fun. So thanks to Cedric as always, and we will see you. And oh yeah, Christine was on the last one. Sorry. Thanks to Cedric. We'll see you next time. And I'm losing it because I've been drinking for 2 hours. See you guys soon.
Thanks, guys.